A violent pulse hit the radar screen, and Major Carroll Smith snapped to it. Something fast and low was tearing through the night, straight toward the island. The Black Widow's cockpit shook as he climbed into the darkness where bombers had hunted his men every night for 2 relentless weeks. Below him, 20,000 Americans slept under a target they couldn't see. As the blip closed in, one question cut through the roar of his engines. Was he about to stop a killer or die before he ever found it? Smith's P-61 was unlike anything the Japanese had ever flown against. The Northrop Black Widow was the first American aircraft deliberately engineered for night combat, not adapted into it. Its 66-foot wings stretched wide across the darkness. Driven by twin Pratt and Whitney R-2800 engines, each one delivering 2,000 horsepower. At full throttle, it could push toward 366 miles per hour. But raw speed wasn't the secret to its power. The real advantage was invisible. The SCR-720 radar buried inside the nose. It could sense an aircraft 5 miles away, even on a night so dark you couldn't see your own wingtip. Japanese crews had no idea such a system existed. They flew at night because they believed darkness was a shield. The radar turned that shield into a trap. Behind Smith, separated by an internal bulkhead and the glow of his instruments, sat his radar operator, Lieutenant Philip Porter. For 6 months, Porter had lived inside that pale green world, learning to interpret every subtle movement of the blips drifting across his scopes. He knew how to sort friend from enemy, how to judge altitude by the arc of a return, and how to guide his pilot toward a target without ever seeing it with his own eyes. But tonight, the math staring back at them was merciless. 1 P-61, 12 Japanese bombers. If Smith chased down one, 11 others would keep going. Even if he managed to destroy 3 or 4, the rest would strike the American airfields. Damage would be inevitable, casualties unavoidable. Worse, the entire invasion timetable could be thrown off course. Smith had spent 18 months preparing for a night exactly like this. At Orlando Army Airfield, he'd endured endless nights of radar intercept training, blind gunnery and navigation with no visual horizon, flying through blackness so complete it blurred into sensory deprivation. Night fighting was the most unforgiving type of aerial combat. You relied on instruments, on radar, and on the hope that the shadow you were hunting wasn't a friendly aircraft stumbling into your path. The 418th Night Fighter Squadron knew that reality well. Their first combat missions in November 1943 had launched from rough, barely graded strips carved into New Guinea. At the time, they flew P-70 Havocs and later P-38 Lightnings, outfitted with early temperamental radar that worked only when it felt like cooperating. Everything changed when the P-61 arrived in September 1944. The Black Widow was stable, powerful, and most importantly, equipped with radar that actually functioned. But radar couldn't change the situation Smith faced now. 12 bombers were inbound. His fuel would give him roughly 3 hours in the air. If each engagement took 10 minutes, he could intercept only 3 before turning back. That meant 9 bombers would slip through. 9 bombers could turn the airfields into burning craters. Back inside the cockpit, the story moved forward. Porter's voice broke through the intercom at 2342. He had 4 distinct contacts on the scope, all heading south toward Murrow, each at its own altitude. Smith needed to choose which one to chase first, and whether the strategy forming in his mind was brilliant or hopeless. He shoved the throttles forward. The two R2-800 engines responded instantly, lifting the Black Widow into a 2,000-foot per minute climb. Porter fed him vectors, heading 035, altitude 8,000 feet, range 4 miles. Smith stared out into the canopy, but the world beyond it was nothing but layered black. Heavy clouds hid the stars. Even the faintest hints of moonlight were gone. It was the kind of night the Japanese considered perfect for their operations. What they didn't know was that Smith wasn't relying on his eyes. In the nose, the SCR-720's rotating, parabolic dish swept out a fan of microwave pulses. Anything solid within a 180-degree arc would reflect those pulses back. On Porter's display, each returning signal bloomed as a glowing trace. One scope showed left-right movement relative to the aircraft's nose. The other showed vertical position, above or below their flight path. Porter monitored both simultaneously. He issued calm, precise corrections, left 5 degrees, down 3. Smith followed them blindly, trusting the voice behind him. At 3 miles, the range closed enough for Smith to activate his own simplified radar display integrated into the main panel. It offered far less detail than Porter's system, but it told him what mattered, where the target was relative to him. The contact resolved into a Mitsubishi G4M, the bomber Americans called the Betty, 2,000 horsepower engines, a 7-man crew, a bomb load of 1,760 pounds, and a fatal flaw: its fuel tanks weren't protected. A single burst could transform the aircraft into a burning wreck. Range, 2 miles. Smith watched the steady, unwavering blip. The Betty's crew remained unaware. Japanese bombers carried no tail warning radar. They trusted the darkness behind them. Tonight, that trust was deadly. At 1,000 yards, Smith they still couldn't see anything visually. He relied entirely on the instruments as he closed. 800 yards, then 6. Only at 500 yards did he finally catch a faint outline, a blacker shape against the black sky, with tiny orange flecks marking the bomber's exhaust flames. Smith eased the P-61 below and behind the Betty. The cannons, fixed beneath the fuselage, demanded he aim the entire aircraft rather than move a turret. He framed the bomber in the glowing reticle of his N6 gun sight. Range, 400 yards. He armed the cannons, 200 rounds per gun, 800 total. Enough for 40 seconds of continuous fire, though a night fighter pilot never used more than tiny bursts. At 350 yards, he fired. The 4 Hispano M2 cannons roared together. High explosive shells shot forward at nearly 3,000 feet per second, their tracers forming crimson streaks. Smith held the trigger for 2 seconds. 12 rounds per cannon, 48 shells in all. The Betty's right wing erupted in flame. The bomber rolled sharply, plunging into a steep dive. Fire lit the clouds beneath it. The aircraft hit the water 8 miles north of Murrow at 23:57. 1 bomber down, 11 still coming. Smith checked his fuel. He'd already burned through 15%, and Porter had 3 more contacts on the scope, spread across miles of pitch-black sky. Smith had 112 minutes of fuel left. At 0014, Porter identified the second target, heading 180, altitude 6,000 feet, range 6 miles. Smith turned south and descended, But the geometry was punishing. The bomber was 23 miles from the first intercept. Even at a cruise speed of 280 miles per hour, he'd need 5 minutes to reach it. 5 minutes the bomber would use to creep closer to Muro and the airfields beneath it. Smith shoved the Black Widow faster, pushing to 320 power settings. That high devoured fuel. Every minute at maximum consumed 3 minutes of endurance. But if he didn't accelerate, the bomber might reach its target zone. Anti-aircraft crews would have to fire blindly into the night. Bombs could fall. The mission could fail. Night interception demanded perfection. Most sorties ended with no contact at all. The Pacific sky was immense, and radar could only do so much. In 14 months, the 418th Night Fighter Squadron had scored 18 kills total. Smith already had 4. Taking 4 more in a single night would make him the top American night fighter ace of the war. But the thought meant nothing in the moment. The only focus was stopping those bombers. Porter guided him closer, range 4 miles, 3, 2. At 1 mile, Smith spotted it. Another Betty. Same vulnerable design, but this one flew lower, 6,000 feet, leaving Smith less altitude to maneuver. He slid the P-61 beneath and behind the bomber. The approach had to be perfect. Too fast, and he'd blast past the target. Too slow, and the Japanese crew might detect him. Surprise was the only advantage a night fighter had. 500 yards. For the first time, Smith saw the Betty's shape clearly. Dark against dark, the bomber flew steady, unaware. The Black Widow's midnight paint and quiet engines kept it hidden. Smith centered the target in the gun sight. Range, 350 yards. He fired again. Another tight 2-second burst, 48 rounds. Shells ripped through the bomber's fuselage. One engine caught fire, then the second. Flames crawled across the wings. The aircraft pitched forward and fell toward the ocean. It hit the water at 0019, 2 bombers down, 10 still moving toward Muro. Smith glanced at the gauge. 42% fuel remained. The night was only getting started. Porter now had 2 more contacts on his scope. Both were closer to Muro than the previous bombers. Both flew at different altitudes, one at 9,000 feet, one at 4,000, separated by 8 miles of black air. Smith made his choice. He would go for the higher target first. Climbing cost less fuel than a steep dive and recovery, but the higher bomber also sat farther north. Chasing it meant giving the low flyer more time to creep toward the airfields. If he chose wrong, if that lower bomber got through and hit the runways or fuel dumps, the mission would be remembered as a failure. Smith banked north and began to climb. The P-61 reached 9,000 feet at 0023. Porter locked onto the third contact, range 7 miles, heading 160, speed 190 knots. But almost immediately, it was clear this bomber was not like the others. It was faster than the Bettys, and it was not flying straight. It turned, drifted in altitude, climbed, then dropped again. Someone aboard that aircraft understood American night fighters were out here. The third bomber was a Nakajima Ki-49 Donu, known to American crews as the Helen. It was quicker than the Betty, capable of 306 miles per hour, and it carried stronger defensive armament, 7.7 millimeter machine guns. The tail gunner had an excellent field of fire directly down the bomber's wake. A straight-in approach from dead astern would put Smith directly in that gunner's sights. Smith changed the plan. Instead of sliding in behind the Helen, he shifted his attack vector. He brought the P-61 up from below and off to the left, where the bomber's underside hid its blind spots. Most Japanese bombers had poor ventral coverage. Their bellies were exposed. Smith intended to use that weakness. Range dropped to 1 mile. The Helen kept weaving through the darkness, left then right, climbing 200 feet, then dropping 300. The pilot knew that straight, level flight made a bomber easy prey. Irregular changes in altitude and heading scrambled radar plots and forced radar operators to work for every bit of closure. Porter adapted. He watched the pattern, studied the rhythm of the turns, and anticipated each move a beat ahead. He did not just follow the Helen's path. He guessed where it would be next and vectored Smith toward that point. Smith closed to 600 yards. The Helen suddenly snapped into a sharp right turn. Smith rolled the P-61 with it, the twin boom. Black Widow, designed for stability at night, responded smoothly. The aircraft dug into the turn, and the bomber remained framed in Smith's gun sight. Range 500 yards, 450, 400. At 375 yards, the Helen's tail gunner finally saw the dark shape below and behind. A stream of tracers slashed past Smith's canopy. The gunner had found his range. Surprise was gone. Smith had only seconds. In another moment, the Helen's pilot would throw the bomber into violent evasive maneuvers, and the clean shooting solution would disappear. He pulled the trigger. A 3-second burst, 72 rounds. Longer than his previous engagements, but the maneuvering target demanded it. The 4 20mm shells hammered into the Helen's fuselage. The right engine erupted in fire. The bomber rolled inverted and dropped into a spin. Smith broke away, pulling clear of the falling wreck to avoid flying through its debris. The burning aircraft tumbled through 9,000 feet, then 8, then 7. It struck the water at 0029, 29 minutes after midnight. 3 bombers destroyed. 9 still somewhere in the dark. Smith checked the fuel gauge. 28%. That was a dangerous number. Most pilots headed home at 30%. Anything below that left almost no margin. A delay, a missed approach, an unexpected headwind. Any of it could end with an engine sputtering out over the ocean. At night, over open water, with no visual references, a pilot could not judge height. The aircraft would hit the surface before he sensed how low he had come. Porter still had one more contact on the scope. The 4th target, heading 170, altitude 4,000 feet, range 9 miles. It was the same low-flying bomber Smith had skipped earlier. Now it sat only 12 miles from Muro, close enough that Smith could see American searchlights stabbing thin white beams into the night. On the ground, anti-aircraft batteries were manned and ready. Gunners stood by their weapons, fingers resting on triggers, waiting for a silhouette to cross their sights. Smith dropped the nose and descended toward the 4th bomber. A controlled dive conserved fuel. The P-61 slid through 8,000 feet, then 7, 6, 5. He leveled off at 4,200 feet, just above the target's altitude. From there, he held the advantage. He could dive down onto the bomber, let gravity build speed, and shorten the window in which the enemy could react. Range 4 miles. 3, 2. At 1 mile, Smith spotted it. Another Betty. The bomber flew straight toward Muro, unwavering. No evasive turns, no altitude changes. Either the pilot did not know American night fighters were operating nearby, or he no longer cared. For many Japanese crews, survival was secondary to finishing the mission. Completing the objective outweighed the odds of coming home. Smith eased the P-61 into its familiar killing position, slightly below and behind. Range 350 yards. He checked his ammunition counter. 512 rounds left, enough for 3 solid attacks, maybe 4 if he disciplined his bursts. But this was the 4th target of the night. There might not be another chance. Every shell mattered. His fuel gauge showed 23%, below safety margin. If he fired and missed, he would not have enough fuel to chase, reposition, and attack again. 1 run, 1 burst, then he would have to turn back, whether the bomber fell or not. At 0034, he committed. He fired a 2-second burst, 48 rounds. The 20-millimeter shells converged on the center of the Betty's fuselage. The port wing tore away from the aircraft. Fuel tanks ruptured. Fire washed across the remaining structure. The bomber rolled hard to the left and dropped toward the water. It hit the ocean at 0035. 35 minutes after midnight. 4 bombers destroyed in 55 minutes. Smith turned the P-61 back toward Muro. Fuel, 21%. The calculation was straightforward. McGuire Field lay 18 miles to the south. At cruise speed, the Black Widow burned roughly 100 gallons per hour. Smith had about 60 gallons left, giving him approximately 36 minutes of flight time. In theory, that was comfortably enough to return, if nothing unexpected occurred. Porter swept his radar again. The scope was clear. The remaining 8 Japanese bombers had turned back. Whether they had caught fragments of frantic radio calls or simply decided the attack was hopeless now did not matter. What mattered was the result. The mission was, by any operational measure, a success. 4 enemy aircraft destroyed. No American casualties. The airfields untouched. Construction crews free to work through the night. The Lingayen Gulf invasion schedule held firm. But Smith's work in the sky was not over. At 0042, Porter picked up a new contact, heading north. Range 4 miles, altitude 7,000 feet. Smith checked his position, 12 miles from McGuire Field, fuel at 19%. The unknown aircraft now sat between him and his base. If it was a Japanese bomber, it was flying toward the very airfields he had just defended. Engaging would cost more fuel, possibly too much. He might not have enough to reach the runway afterward. But letting a hostile aircraft stroll toward Muro, unchallenged, was worse. Smith had already destroyed 4 aircraft. If a 5th slipped through and killed Americans on the ground because he had chosen to save fuel, the entire night's achievement would be stained. In the end, the arithmetic of conscience overrode the arithmetic of fuel. Smith turned toward the contact. Porter called vectors. The range dropped quickly. 3 miles, 2, 1. At 800 yards, Smith got visual contact. It was not a bomber. It was a Nakajima Ki-84 Hayate, frank to American pilots. A single-engine fighter with a top speed of 392 miles per hour, armed with 4 12.7 millimeter machine guns and 2 20 millimeter cannons. one of the best fighters in the Japanese arsenal. On paper, the Frank outclassed the Black Widow. It was faster, more agile, with a superior rate of climb. In daylight, flown by a skilled pilot, it could outfight a P-61. But this was not daylight, and the Frank had no radar. Its pilot flew blind, sweeping his gaze through featureless darkness, hoping to catch the glint of a wing or the shadow of an engine glow. There was nothing to see. Smith had the only real advantage. The fighter pilot did not know he was being hunted. He moved the P-61 below and behind the Frank. Range, 500 yards. The approach mirrored his runs on the bombers. Close in, steady, invisible until the last moment. But a fighter was a much smaller target, harder to hit cleanly, and the Frank's cockpit and engine areas were partially armored. A short 2-second burst might not be enough. Smith closed to 300 yards. His fuel gauge read 17%. If he missed this shot, there would be no time for a second attempt. He would have to break off immediately and pray the remaining fuel was enough to get him to Maguire Field. Missing would also warn the Frank that American night fighters were operating nearby, making future missions far more dangerous. He steadied the gun sight on the fighter's silhouette. His finger rested on the trigger. The decision now was brutally simple. If he fired, his fuel would drop to about 15%, below the minimum safety guidelines. If he let the fighter go, he risked leaving a deadly aircraft free to attack American pilots or ground crews. The P-61's engines hummed steadily at 320 miles per hour. Ahead of him, the Frank flew straight and level. At 0045, Smith chose. He squeezed the trigger. A 3-second burst. 72 rounds, the longest of the night. The shells smashed through the Frank's tail section and engine cowling. The engine erupted in flames. Thick black smoke streamed from the nose. The fighter rolled sharply right and dove. Smith watched it fall. Through 7,000 feet, 6, 5. The fire grew brighter against the night sky. At 3,000 feet, the Japanese pilot bailed out. Smith saw the parachute open, a white canopy stark against the black. The Frank continued its fall and hit the water at 0046. Smith glanced at the fuel gauge. 15%. The engagement had cost more fuel than his earlier mental estimate. Maguire Field lay 11 miles to the south. At cruise power, the P-61's consumption rate gave him roughly 22 minutes of flying time, enough to reach the field with only a thin reserve. Any headwind, any navigational mistake, and he would be gliding over dark water in a powerless aircraft. Porter turned from fighter hunter to navigator. Using radar returns, he guided Smith toward Muro. On the scope, the island appeared as a solid block of echo, its coastline clearly traced. Maguire Field sat on the southwestern edge. The airfield had been operational for just 4 days. Lighting was minimal. There was no instrument landing system, no approach aids. Pilots had only a single row of kerosene lamps bordering the runway. From 5 miles out, those lamps were little more than dim yellow specks, easy to lose in the blackness. Smith brought the P-61 down to 2,000 feet. Fuel, 13%. The tanks held 646 gallons in total. 13% meant 84 gallons left. At cruise settings, that translated into 18 minutes of flying time. He was 8 miles from the field. At 280 miles per hour, that gave him around 1.7 minutes to reach the landing pattern. Enough fuel, barely. At 0052, he finally saw the runway lights, 12 faint lamps in a straight line. The runway stretched 5,000 feet, made of crushed coral. Engineers had finished it on December 26th, the same day the 418th Night Fighter Squadron arrived. It was suitable for P-61 operations, but it lacked the safety buffers of older bases. No overrun area, no crash barriers. At night, with only a handful of lamps for guidance, any landing mistake could be fatal. Smith entered the landing pattern at 1,000 feet, fuel 11%, 57 gallons. During approach, fuel burn increased. Power up for turns, power back for descents. Each adjustment cost him. He calculated that he had about 12 minutes of fuel remaining. More than enough for a straightforward landing, unless something went wrong. At 0055, something did. The runway lights went out. All 12 lamps died at once. In an instant, the runway vanished. Total darkness. Smith was 3 miles from the field, 800 feet high, flying 140 knots. Without lights, he had no sense of height or distance. If he continued with a standard approach, the P-61 would slam into the ground before he realized how low he was. Porter suggested the only tool left, the radar altimeter. It measured their height above the surface by sending radio waves downward and timing their return, accurate to within 50 feet. In theory, Smith could descend slowly using the altimeter and dead reckoning. When the instrument read 0 feet, the aircraft would be on the ground. In practice, if his navigation was off, 0 might mean jungle, coral, or construction equipment. Smith's fuel gauge now showed 9%, 46 gallons, 8 minutes of flight time. Not enough to climb and divert anywhere. Takabot-on-Lay was the nearest alternate field, 90 miles to the northeast. He would run out of fuel 40 miles short. He had only one realistic option: land at McGuire Field in darkness, or crash into the ocean and trust the sea and luck. The choice, for Smith, was straightforward. He had survived 4 intercepts. He had scored 5 kills in 55 minutes, the highest single-night total for any American night fighter pilot in the Pacific Theater. He had protected the airfields, preserved the invasion schedule, and saved lives. To die now because a line of kerosene lamps failed would strip all of it of meaning. He turned the P-61 toward where he believed the runway lay. Altitude 600 feet. Fuel 9%. The blackness beneath him felt endless. He dropped to 400 feet. The radar altimeter showed 380 feet above the ground. He eased the airspeed back to 120 knots. With flaps fully extended, the P-61 stall speed was 95 knots. 120 knots left him a 25-knot buffer. Not much, but slowing further would burn more fuel. The numbers were not on his side. Porter watched the scope, tracking the outline of McGuire Field sat about a mile inland and from the beach. Smith held his compass heading. The runway ran north-south. He was approaching from the north on a heading of 180. If his navigation was correct, the runway should be directly ahead. If it was not, he would touch down in jungle, equipment, or on coral. At 0058, Smith lowered the landing gear. 3 green indicators lit up, all 3 wheels down and locked. Main gear under each engine nacelle. Nose gear under the forward fuselage. The P-61's landing gear was built to handle rough airstrips, But without visual cues, Smith could not judge where on the runway he would hit. A heavy impact could collapse a strut, send the aircraft tumbling. Fuel, 7%, 36 gallons. About 5 minutes of flight time left. He dropped the flaps to full. Airspeed bled down to 110 knots. The Black Widow sank at around 300 feet per minute. The radar altimeter ticked downward. 250 feet, 200, 150. Outside, there was still nothing but black. No horizon, no shapes, no hint of ground. Only instruments and faith in his calculations. At 100 feet, he pulled the power back. The descent rate increased to 400 feet per minute, steeper than a standard approach, but necessary. Fuel was almost gone. 75 feet, 50, 25. Smith prepared for impact. His hands tightened on the control column. His feet rested lightly on the rudder pedals, ready to correct any sudden yaw. The P-61's main wheels hit crushed coral. At 00:59, the landing was hard. The shock jolted through the aircraft, but the gear held. 3 seconds later, the nose wheel settled down. Smith applied the brakes. The P-61 slowed rapidly. 100 knots, 80, 60, 40. At 20 knots, the aircraft was barely rolling. He still had no idea where he sat on the runway. It did not matter. He kept braking until the P-61 came to a complete stop. Fuel, 6%, 29 gallons. Roughly 3 minutes of flying time remained. Ground crew rushed out with flashlights, cutting narrow tunnels through the dark. They found the P-61 sitting motionless on the runway and guided it in, walking in front of the nose with their beams held high, waving Smith toward the parking area. The Black Widow's engines finally wound down and fell silent at 01:03, exactly 1 hour and 3 minutes after takeoff. Smith opened the canopy and climbed out of the cockpit. His legs felt heavy and stiff. His hands trembled when they met the cold metal of the ladder. It was not fear anymore. It was pure, drained exhaustion. 5 intercepts, 5 kills, 1 landing in total darkness, all crammed into 63 minutes of combat. Porter emerged from the radar compartment behind him, eyes red from staring into the green glow of the scope. He had spent the entire mission bent over that screen, tracking 5 targets without losing a single one, vectoring Smith to every intercept, holding contact through turns, dives, and bursts of gunfire. Without Porter's skill, not one of those kills would have happened. Night fighting was never a solo act. It was a team locked together in the dark, pilot and radar operator moving as one. The ground crew circled the Black Widow with inspection lamps, checking every panel and surface. They found no damage, no bullet holes, no torn skin, no bent metal. All 4 cannons had run perfectly. When they checked the ammunition counters, the numbers told their own story. 408 rounds fired. Smith had lifted off with 800 rounds of 20mm ammunition and landed with 392 still in the belts, enough for 2 more full intercepts. He had plenty of shells left, but no fuel for even a single additional chase. The tanks were nearly dry. At 1:15, the intelligence officers arrived, notebooks in hand. They wanted everything: times, headings, altitudes, positions, aircraft types. Standing there on the crushed coral, Smith walked them through the night from memory. 4 Mitsubishi G4, Betty bombers. 1 Nakajima K-49 Helen bomber. 1 Nakajima Ki-84 Frank fighter. All destroyed between 2,357 on December 29th and 0046 on December 30th. 49 minutes of actual engagement. The intelligence teams later confirmed every claim from multiple sources. Ground radar had tracked the intercepts exactly where Smith said they occurred. Coast watchers reported seeing aircraft fall into the sea. At first light, wreckage fields were visible on the water. 4 bombers and 1 fighter, all in the locations Smith described. Nothing missing, nothing exaggerated. 4 kills in a single night tied the standing record for American night fighter pilots. Most men would have ended the story there. Smith did not. On December 30th, 1944, at 14:30 hours, he flew a second mission from the same airfield. Japanese reconnaissance aircraft had been sighted over Muro, single-engine fighters faster than bombers, smaller targets, harder to pin down on radar. Smith and Porter took off again in the same P-61. Times A. Waston had been fully turned around. 800 rounds of 20mm ammunition loaded, 646 gallons of fuel in the tanks. At 15:12, Porter picked up a new contact, heading north at 12,000 feet, range 8 miles. Smith climbed to meet it, using altitude as his advantage. As the range closed, they identified the target. Another Nakajima Ki-84 Frank fighter. In level flight, the Frank was faster than the P-61, but this time Smith sat above it. He rolled the Black Widow over and dove. Gravity added its own speed. The P-61 accelerated to 390 miles per hour, faster than the Frank could manage in level flight. At 400 yards, Smith put the fighter in his gun sight and pressed the trigger. 2-second burst, 48 rounds. The Frank's engine detonated. The aircraft rolled inverted and plunged straight into the ocean. That was Smith's 7th confirmed kill. That last victory made him the top-scoring American night fighter ace of World War II. 7 confirmed kills, all achieved in less than 24 hours of combat flying. No other American night fighter pilot in any theater, European, Pacific, China, Burma, India, or Mediterranean, would match that total. The 418th Night Fighter Squadron continued operations from Muro through January 1945. Night after night, their P-61s rose into the dark to protect fleets and airfields. By the end of the war, the squadron was credited with 18 aerial victories, the highest total of any P-61 unit in the Pacific theater. Smith's 7 kills accounted for 39% of that total. Nearly 2 out of every 5 enemy aircraft shot down by the squadron fell to his guns. Porter's role did not go unnoticed. For his work behind the radar scope, his calm voice, quick judgments, and flawless tracking under pressure, he received the Distinguished Flying Cross. Every intercept they made together began on his glowing screen. The P-61, Times A. Waston, stayed on combat duty through May 1945. It survived the war without a single recorded battle wound, no flak damage, no quick crash landings, no emergency belly landing. After VJ Day, its fate was decided not by enemy fire, but by peacetime routine. Like most Black Widows, it was scrapped. The nose art, the string of kill markings, the aircraft that had hunted 4 bombers in 80 minutes, all cut up and melted, preserved only in photographs and paperwork. Today, only 4 P-61 Black Widows still exist anywhere in the world. None of them is Smith's aircraft. Time's a-wastin' is gone. Muir Field, the strip Smith defended that December night, went on to play exactly the role planners had envisioned. It supported the Lingayen Gulf invasion on schedule. On January 9th, 1945, American forces came ashore. P-51 Mustangs and P-47 Thunderbolts, flying from Muro, provided the air cover that shielded the landings from Japanese air attack. Post-war analysis by engineers estimated that if Japanese bombs had hit the construction areas on December 29th, airfield completion would have been delayed by roughly 2 weeks. Those 2 weeks would have pushed back the invasion timetable. More ships exposed offshore. More troops on the beaches without full air support. More casualties. A longer, harder push inland. Smith did not stay to see any of that work summed up in reports and estimates. He survived the war, returned to the United States in February 1946, left the military, and blended back into civilian life. He did not seek interviews. He did not write memoirs. He did not lecture about his missions. His achievements live mostly in the quiet language of military archives, unit histories, intelligence summaries, kill lists, mission logs, dates and times, aircraft types, confirmed destroyed. The P-61 Black Widow itself proved what a dedicated night fighter could achieve. Around 700 were built. They served in every major theater: Europe, the Pacific, China, Burma, India, the Mediterranean. From 1944 through 1945, they dominated the night sky in a way no earlier aircraft had managed. After the war, the P-61 was redesignated F-61 and remained in service until 1954, when jet-powered night fighters with higher speed and altitude finally replaced it. But in December 1944, over the black waters around Muro, the Black Widow was the most advanced night fighter in the world, and Carroll Smith was the best man flying it. If this story reached you, even for a moment, then you now carry a fragment of a night almost no one remembers, a night when one pilot, one radar operator, and one black-painted aircraft held back a tide of destruction with nothing but discipline, instinct, and the cold glow of a radar screen. If you felt that, let YouTube know this story matters. Hit the like button. It's a small action, but it tells the algorithm that this history should not fade. And if you want more of these hidden chapters, the ones buried in forgotten after-action reports and yellowing intelligence files, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. Every day we're digging people like Major Carroll Smith and Lieutenant Philip Porter out of the dusty corners of history and giving them the voice they were denied. Before you go, drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. The United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, somewhere far from the Pacific waters these men fought over. Our community reaches across continents and oceans, bound together by a shared belief that stories like this should outlive the men who lived them. And if someone in your family served, in any branch, any war, any role, tell us. Their names deserve a space where they're spoken again, because what you did just now wasn't passive. By watching, by listening, by caring, you helped lift Major Carroll Smith out of the footnotes. You kept him from slipping into silence, the silence that swallows too many heroes whose only mistake was being humble. Men like him didn't fight for fame. They fought because someone had to stand in the dark when others slept. Thank you for being here. Thank you for remembering. And thank you for ensuring that on the nights when history grows quiet, Major Carroll Smith and the men like him are never forgotten.